Hi guys, today we are going to tell you this. You think you know the story of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans, a narrow mountain pass, a hopeless last stand against an endless Persian army. It's one of the most famous stories in all of history, told in movies, books, classrooms, and speeches about courage and freedom. A story so powerful that questioning it almost feels wrong. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost everything you think you know about the Battle of Thermopylae is wrong. Not exaggerated wrong, the numbers were wrong, the motives were wrong. Even the reason the battle was fought has been misunderstood for over 2,000 years, and the real story is far more interesting and far more human than the legend, because Thermopylae was not a glorious suicide mission. It was not just 300 versus a million, and it was not a simple tale of freedom versus tyranny. It was a desperate political gamble, a fragile alliance on the brink of collapse, and a calculated sacrifice made by men who understood exactly what they were doing and what their deaths would be used for afterward. To understand what really happened at Thermopylae, we first have to strip away the myth. The version most people know begins with an unstoppable Persian army marching west, darkening the earth with arrows, while Greece trembles in fear. Only Sparta, proud and defiant, dares to stand in their way. But because of strange laws or ancient rituals, Sparta can only send 300 warriors. They march north knowing they will die and choose glory over survival. It's a beautiful story. It's also propaganda. The truth is messier, more political, and far less comfortable. Greece at this moment was not united. It was fractured, divided, and deeply suspicious of itself. Many Greek city-states did not want to fight Persia at all. Some actively sided with the invaders. Others waited to see who would win before choosing a side. Even Sparta, the supposed symbol of defiance, was not eager to fight a massive war far from home. So when the Persian army began moving toward Greece, panic spread. Not just fear of invasion, but fear of betrayal. Who would fight, who would submit, and who would switch sides the moment things went badly. This is the world Thermopylae was born into, and that narrow mountain pass was not chosen for honor or destiny. It was chosen because it was one of the very few places where a small force could slow a much larger one, not defeat it, but delay it. Delay was the goal, not victory, not martyrdom. Time for Greek cities to argue less and prepare more. Time for fleets to gather. Time for decisions that would determine whether Greece would even exist a generation later. And the force sent to Thermopylae was never meant to be just 300 men. That idea came later. In reality, thousands of Greek soldiers marched north. They came from different cities with different loyalties, different fears, and different reasons for being there. The Spartans were important, but they were not alone, and they were not the entire story. So how did we end up with the legend of the 300? Because after the dust settled, after the war was over, after some Greeks could claim victory and others could not, a simpler story was needed, a cleaner one. A story that inspired pride instead of awkward questions. A story where complexity was replaced by heroism. But when you look closely at the strategy, the decisions, and the aftermath, Thermopylae stops looking like a doomed last stand and starts looking like one of the most carefully calculated sacrifices in ancient history. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because before we can understand how the myth was built, we need to understand what Greece was really afraid of. When the Persian Empire began moving west, it wasn't just another invading army. It was the largest, richest, and most experienced imperial power the ancient world had ever seen. Persia didn't conquer by accident. It absorbed kingdoms, cities, and entire cultures through a combination of overwhelming force, diplomacy, and fear. Many places didn't even fight. They surrendered, paid tribute, and were allowed to keep their customs under Persian rule. And that was exactly what terrified Greece. Because Persia didn't need to destroy Greece to defeat it. It only needed to convince Greek cities that resistance was pointless. For decades, the Persian Empire had been expanding steadily, swallowing up the eastern Mediterranean. Ionian Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor had already fallen under Persian control. Some rebelled, they were crushed. Others cooperated and survived. So when Persian messengers arrived in mainland Greece demanding earth and water, symbols of submission, many cities gave them exactly that. Not because they were cowards, but because resistance seemed suicidal. Greece was not a nation. It was a patchwork of rival city-states, each jealous of the other, each guarding its own interests. Athens distrusted Sparta. Sparta distrusted Athens. Smaller cities distrusted both. Alliances shifted constantly, and old grudges were never forgotten. In that environment, the idea of unified resistance was fragile at best. Some leaders argued that Persia was inevitable, better to submit early and preserve autonomy than resist and be annihilated. Others believed Persia could be beaten, but only if Greece somehow set aside centuries of rivalry. That debate was still raging when news arrived that the Persian king himself was coming. This was not a punitive expedition. This was not a raid. This was conquest. The Persian army that marched west was vast, but more importantly, it was organized. It included infantry, cavalry, engineers, supply chains, and naval support. It moved deliberately, methodically, absorbing territory as it advanced. The goal was not just victory, it was control, and Persia expected Greece to fracture under the pressure. In many ways, that expectation was reasonable. Some Greek cities immediately defected. Others hesitated, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Only a minority committed to resistance early, and even then they argued endlessly about strategy. Where should they fight, on land or at sea? North or south? Who should lead? Every decision risked splitting the alliance apart. This is why Thermopylae mattered, not because it was glorious, but because it forced Greece to make a choice. Thermopylae was a narrow coastal pass between mountains and sea, one of the few routes an army could use to enter central Greece. In most places, the road was so tight that only a handful of men could fight abreast. Cavalry was useless. Numbers mattered less. It was defensible temporarily. Holding Thermopylae would not stop the Persian invasion. Everyone knew that, but it could slow it down. And slowing the Persians meant buying time for something even more important: unity. As long as the pass held, Greek cities could not pretend the war was someone else's problem. The enemy was at the door. Decisions had to be made. So a force was assembled, not an army meant to win, an army meant to delay, and leading that force was the Spartan king. Now here's where the myth begins to diverge sharply from reality. Sparta did not send only 300 men because it was all they had. Sparta had thousands of trained soldiers. What limited them was not manpower, it was politics, religion, and fear of leaving home exposed. At that moment, Sparta was bound by religious observances that restricted full military mobilization. But religion was not the only factor. The Spartan ruling class was deeply anxious about rebellion. Their society depended on the suppression of a massive enslaved population. Sending the entire army north would leave Sparta vulnerable. So the solution was a compromise. A small, elite force would go ahead. Enough to lead to signal commitment and to hold the line temporarily, but not so many that Sparta risked everything. The 300 were not random warriors. Each man was selected carefully. They were veterans, they were fathers, men whose sons were old enough to carry on their names. Sparta was not being poetic, it was being practical. If they died, their families and lineage would survive, but they were never meant to fight alone. Along the road north, other Greek contingents joined them. Hoplites from various cities, bringing the total force into the thousands. They camped together, trained together, argued together. This was not a unified army in spirit, it was a coalition held together by necessity. And that tension was felt immediately. Some Greeks doubted the plan, others questioned whether the Spartans would truly stand their ground. Sparta had a reputation for discipline, but also for acting in its own interest. Trust was thin. Meanwhile, the Persian army advanced. Villages were abandoned, fields were left unharvested. Smoke rose in the distance as cities chose submission or evacuation. Refugees fled south, carrying stories that grew darker with every retelling. By the time the Persians reached the outskirts of Thermopylae, fear had already done much of their work. And yet when the Persian king finally arrived and surveyed the pass, he underestimated what stood before him. He saw a small force blocking the road. Men grooming their hair, exercising, seemingly unconcerned. He assumed they would break either through fear or exhaustion. He waited, days passed. The Greeks did not retreat, they did not surrender, and so the first assaults began. What happened next shocked the Persians. Wave after wave of troops advanced into the narrow pass, only to be pushed back by disciplined ranks of hoplites. Heavy shields locked together, spears thrust in unison. Men fought shoulder to shoulder, rotating the front line to maintain strength. This was not heroic chaos, it was methodical slaughter. The terrain did exactly what the Greeks hoped it would do. Persian numbers became a liability. Units could not maneuver, cavalry was useless, even elite troops struggled to make progress. For 2 days the line held, but the Greeks were not winning. They were bleeding. Every hour cost lives. Every engagement reduced their strength. They knew the Persians would eventually find another way through because there was always another way, and that way was known. High above the pass was a narrow mountain path used by locals, barely wide enough for a column of men. The Greeks knew about it. They posted guards there, but the guard force was small, drawn from allies whose loyalty was uncertain. When a local revealed the path to the Persians, the outcome became inevitable. The Persians did not rush. They did not attack recklessly. They moved carefully through the night, climbing, positioning, preparing to strike from behind. At dawn, the Greeks learned the truth. They were surrounded. This is the moment the legend loves to linger on, the point of no return, the heroic choice to fight to the death. But what actually happened next is far more telling. The Spartan king did not order a suicidal charge. He did not demand that everyone die for honor. He dismissed most of the army. Greek contingents were told to withdraw while they still could. Some left eagerly, some hesitated, some argued, but they were allowed to go. What remained was not the entire Greek force, it was a deliberate rearguard. The Spartans stayed, so did a contingent of allies who chose not to leave. This was not desperation, this was strategy. Their deaths would delay the Persians just a little longer, enough to ensure the withdrawal was not harassed, enough to turn defeat into sacrifice. The final fighting was brutal and chaotic. The narrow pass that had once protected the Greeks now trapped them. Spears broke, shields splintered, men fought with swords, with hands, with teeth. The Spartan king fell, his body became a focal point of the struggle. The Greeks fought to recover it, the Persians fought to claim it. The ground was soaked with blood. Eventually the defenders were overwhelmed, not because they lacked courage, but because the plan had reached its end. Thermopylae fell, and yet something strange happened next. The Persian advance paused. Not for long, but long enough. News of the stand spread through Greece. Cities that had hesitated now saw proof that the Persians could be delayed. That resistance was not hopeless. That unity, however fragile, might work. The myth had begun before the bodies were cold. Poets shaped the story, politicians sharpened it. Complexity was stripped away, replaced with symbols simple enough to remember and powerful enough to inspire. 300, one king, one stand. The thousands who fought and withdrew faded from memory. The political compromises vanished. The fear, the doubt, the arguments all erased. What remained was a legend, and that legend would outlive the men who created it. Thermopylae did not end the war. In many ways, it finally forced the war to begin. When news of the fall of the pass reached the rest of Greece, it landed very differently depending on where it was heard. In some cities, it confirmed their worst fears. The Persians were unstoppable. Even the Spartans had been crushed. Resistance now seemed not just dangerous, but foolish. In others, the reaction was the opposite. If a small force could hold back the greatest army on earth for days, if disciplined men fighting on chosen ground could bleed Persia and survive long enough to escape, then maybe this war was not lost before it began. Thermopylae transformed fear into calculation, and calculation was something Greece understood. The delay mattered more than the stand itself. Every hour the Persians were stalled in the north gave Greek leaders time to act. Messengers moved faster than armies. Decisions that had been endlessly debated were suddenly unavoidable. Athens, more than any other city, understood what Thermopylae had truly purchased: time. Athens had already committed to a strategy many Greeks doubted, abandoning their city and fighting at sea. It was a terrifying idea. Leaving homes, temples, and ancestral land behind felt like surrender. But Athenian leaders knew that on land, Persia's numbers would eventually tell. At sea, in narrow straits, the balance could shift. The stand at Thermopylae made that naval strategy possible. While the Persians were delayed in the north, Greek fleets gathered, ships were repaired, crews were trained, alliances were negotiated under the shadow of invasion where neutrality was no longer an option. Some cities still hesitated, but hesitation now came at a cost. Thermopylae had drawn a line in the sand. If you were not resisting, you were submitting, and submission carried consequences. The Persians advanced again, methodically, inevitably. They moved into central Greece, finding cities abandoned, fields scorched, roads empty. Athens was evacuated. The city was burned. Temples were destroyed. To later generations, this looked like catastrophe. To the Greeks who planned it, it was a calculated loss, because while Persia marched through empty land, the Greek fleet waited. When the two navies finally met in narrow waters, the logic of Thermopylae repeated itself. Numbers were blunted by terrain. Coordination mattered more than size. Discipline outweighed sheer mass. The Persians lost ships, then more ships, then momentum. And suddenly, for the first time in the war, Persia did not advance. It hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. What Thermopylae had proven was not that Spartans could die well. It proved that Persia could be slowed. And once an empire built on inevitability loses that illusion, everything changes. Greek confidence grew. Alliance structures hardened. Leadership became clearer. Decisions that once seemed impossible were now accepted as necessary. Thermopylae became a rallying cry not because it was glorious, but because it was useful. The story told afterward focused on sacrifice, but what mattered in the moment was consequence. The Persians eventually withdrew, not defeated outright, but exhausted by distance, logistics, and resistance that refused to collapse on schedule. The war dragged on, and in that dragging the balance shifted. Years later, when say that Greece had won, they simplified again. There was no single victory, no final blow, just a gradual realization that Persia could not impose its will on a fractured but stubborn collection of cities. And in that realization, Thermopylae took on a new meaning. It became proof that resistance had always been possible, proof that unity, however temporary, could work, proof that sacrifice could reshape history, but memory is selective. As time passed, the uncomfortable parts of Thermopylae faded further into the background. The allies who withdrew were rarely mentioned. The political arguments vanished. The fear that dominated Greek decision-making was replaced by certainty and pride. Sparta benefited enormously from this transformation. Though it had not carried the war alone, Thermopylae positioned Sparta as the moral center of Greek resistance. The image of the Spartan warrior, disciplined, obedient, unbreakable, became inseparable from the idea of freedom itself. This was not accidental. Sparta cultivated the myth carefully. Memorials were erected, poems were commissioned. The story was told and retold until it hardened into legend. 300 men, one king, one choice. The simplicity was the point. Complex stories invite debate. Simple stories inspire loyalty. Athens, too, allowed the myth to stand. Despite its decisive naval role, Athens gained something from Thermopylae's legend, unity without rivalry. By elevating Spartan sacrifice, Athens avoided reopening old wounds over leadership and credit. So the myth served everyone who survived, but myths have a cost. They erase the ordinary men who fought and lived. They silence the allies who withdrew. They flatten history into something easier to admire than to understand, and they teach the wrong lessons. Thermopylae is often remembered as a lesson in glorious defeat. In reality, it was a lesson in strategic realism. The men who stayed behind did not believe they were changing the world by dying. They believed they were buying time for others to live and fight. That distinction matters, because when Thermopylae is misunderstood, it becomes a story about death. When it is understood, it becomes a story about restraint, planning, and responsibility. The Spartan king did not choose death because it was noble. He chose it because the alternative was worse, and that kind of choice is far harder to romanticize. In the centuries that followed, Thermopylae was invoked whenever people wanted to glorify sacrifice without examining its purpose. It was used to justify hopeless stands, pointless deaths, and symbolic gestures detached from strategy. But that was never what Thermopylae was. It was not about fighting to the last man no matter what. It was about knowing when holding the line mattered and when it didn't. The men who died at Thermopylae were not reckless. They were disciplined enough to understand that their role was limited, temporary, and final. They did not fight for a slogan. They fought for time, and time reshaped history. By the time the legend of Thermopylae had fully crystallized, the real battle had already been forgotten. What remained was a story polished smooth by repetition, stripped of doubt and contradiction. Yet beneath the legend the truth still waits, a story of fractured cities forced into unity, of leaders balancing pride against survival, of sacrifice chosen not for glory but for necessity. In the final part, we're going to confront the myth head-on, why modern culture still clings to the wrong version of Thermopylae, what we lose when we celebrate the legend instead of the reality, and why understanding what really happened matters far more than repeating what sounds heroic, because Thermopylae was never about dying beautifully. It was about doing something difficult so others wouldn't have to, because Thermopylae was never about dying beautifully. It was about doing something difficult so others wouldn't have to. And yet this is exactly where the story is most often misunderstood. Over centuries, Thermopylae stopped being a historical event and became a moral symbol. A shorthand for courage, a banner people could raise whenever they wanted to talk about sacrifice, honor, or standing against impossible odds. The details no longer mattered. In fact, the details became inconvenient, because the real Thermopylae doesn't fit neatly into the kind of story people like to tell. It isn't clean, it isn't simple, and it doesn't offer easy lessons. Instead, it forces us to confront something far more uncomfortable. That sacrifice only has meaning when it serves a purpose beyond itself. The men who died at Thermopylae were not chasing immortality. They were not acting out a myth they somehow knew would be told. They were soldiers executing a plan whose success depended on restraint, coordination, and acceptance of limits. That is not the kind of heroism that survives well in popular memory, so the story was reshaped. Over time, Thermopylae was transformed from a strategic delaying action into a moral parable. 300 became a magic number. The coalition vanished. The withdrawals were forgotten. The arguments, the doubts, the compromises all erased. What remained was a tale that felt eternal. A tiny group of perfect warriors, an overwhelming enemy, a noble death chosen freely. This version spread because it was useful. It was useful to statesmen who wanted to inspire unity without debate. Useful to generals who wanted obedience without questions. Useful to cultures that valued sacrifice but struggled with complexity. And it was especially useful because it asked nothing of the audience except admiration. You didn't have to understand strategy. You didn't have to wrestle with moral ambiguity. You didn't have to think about what came after. You just had to remember the number. But history doesn't work that way. And when we flatten Thermopylae into a legend, we lose the most important part of the story, the decision-making. Because Thermopylae was defined not by how men died, but by how leaders chose. They chose where to fight. They chose how long to hold. They chose who stayed and who left. And most importantly, they chose not to confuse symbolism with success. The Spartan king's most consequential order was not stand and fight. It was withdraw. That moment rarely appears in retellings. But it is the heart of the story, because it acknowledges a truth that most heroic myths avoid, that survival can be more important than pride, and that knowing when to let go is often harder than knowing when to hold on. Those who left Thermopylae did not flee in shame. They carried the future of the war with them. They brought experience, coordination, and resolve back to the rest of Greece. Without them, later victories would not have been possible, yet in the myth, they are invisible. This selective memory shaped how Thermopylae was used in later generations. Centuries after the battle, people no longer asked, what did Thermopylae achieve? They asked, what did Thermopylae represent? And that shift matters, because representation can be bent to justify almost anything. Thermopylae has been invoked to glorify hopeless resistance, to argue that dying well is better than living with compromise, to suggest that defeat can be noble even when it changes nothing. But the real Thermopylae rejects that idea. If the sacrifice at the pass had accomplished nothing, if the delay had failed, if the alliance had collapsed anyway, it would not be remembered as heroic. It would be remembered, if at all, as tragic and pointless. Meaning came from outcome, and that is a dangerous truth for myths built on purity and absolutes. The Greeks who survived understood this. They did not celebrate Thermopylae because men died. They celebrated it because the sacrifice worked. That distinction has been blurred almost beyond recognition. Modern culture often treats Thermopylae as a celebration of defiance for its own sake. Stand your ground no matter what, fight even when the outcome is certain. Die rather than adapt, but that was never the lesson. The lesson was about choosing the right ground, the right moment, and the right cost. It was about accepting loss in one place to prevent collapse everywhere else. It was about understanding that courage without strategy is noise, not power. When you strip Thermopylae of its context, you turn a careful decision into a reckless one. You turn responsibility into bravado. You turn a story about protecting the future into a story obsessed with death. And that is why the myth persists, because it is easier to admire death than to analyze survival. It is easier to repeat a slogan than to confront the trade-offs real leaders face. It is easier to praise sacrifice than to ask whether it was necessary, effective, or fair. Thermopylae, in reality, demands those questions. It asks us to consider whose lives are spent and for what purpose. It asks us to notice who is remembered and who is forgotten. It asks us to recognize that history is shaped as much by what we choose to ignore as by what we choose to celebrate. The allies who withdrew from Thermopylae disappear from the story because they complicate it. They remind us that courage can look like retreat. That wisdom sometimes means refusing to die, and that is uncomfortable. So instead, the legend rewards only those who stayed, but even among those who stayed, the legend smooths over the reality. They were not calm statues of bravery. They were exhausted, wounded, frightened men carrying out orders in a collapsing situation. Their courage was real, but it was human, not mythical. They did not fight smiling. They did not believe they were invincible. They fought because it was their role and because someone had to. That is a far more sobering image than the one carved into memory, and yet it is also more meaningful because it tells us that history is not shaped by perfect heroes but by flawed people making hard choices under pressure. Thermopylae endures not because it was pure but because it was effective. It bought time, it forced unity, it changed behavior. Once you see that, the legend loses some of its shine, but the real story gains weight. And perhaps that is why we resist it, because the real Thermopylae doesn't let us off the hook. It doesn't allow us to cheer from a distance and feel inspired without reflection. It asks us to think critically about sacrifice, leadership, and memory. It asks us to ask the hardest question of all, not would I die like that, but would I make the decision that leads others to die? That is the question leaders faced at Thermopylae, and it is the question most myths are designed to hide. As long as Thermopylae remains a legend, it is safe. Once it becomes history again, it becomes unsettling, because it shows us that heroism is not always loud, glorious, or clean. Sometimes it looks like compromise, sometimes it looks like retreat, sometimes it looks like ordering others to leave while you stay behind, and that kind of heroism cannot be reduced to a number. 300 is easy to remember. Thousands making coordinated, imperfect decisions is not. So we remember the number, but if we want to truly understand Thermopylae, if we want to respect what those men actually did, we have to let go of the version that flatters us. We have to accept that the battle was not a symbol first, it became a symbol later, and in that transformation something essential was lost, not why they died, but why we still need the story to be wrong. To answer that, we have to return to Thermopylae one last time, not as a legend carved in stone, not as a scene from a movie, but as a real place where real people made decisions under pressure, uncertainty, and fear. Picture the pass again, not the dramatic, towering cliffs you've seen on screen, but a narrow coastal road squeezed between mountain and sea. In places barely wide enough for carts to pass, hot winds, dust, the constant smell of sweat, leather, and salt. The noise of thousands of men waiting, watching, listening. This was not a stage for glory, it was a bottleneck. The men standing there were not thinking about immortality. They were thinking about fatigue, wounds, hunger, and how long they could keep doing this before the line broke. They were thinking about the men beside them, about whether the shield wall would hold, about whether reinforcements would ever come. And above all, their leaders were thinking about time. Every decision at Thermopylae revolved around time. How long could the pass be held? How much blood was too much? At what point did holding the line stop helping and start hurting the wider war? These are not heroic questions, they are managerial ones, and that is exactly why they don't survive well in memory. Because Thermopylae forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. History is often shaped not by dramatic gestures, but by grim calculations. By leaders choosing losses they believe they can afford, hoping, never knowing that the trade will be worth it. The Spartan king did not know how the war would end. He did not know Greece would survive. He did not know his sacrifice would matter in the way later generations would claim. He acted with incomplete information under immense pressure in a situation where every option carried terrible consequences. That is the part of Thermopylae we rarely talk about, because it strips away certainty. The legend tells us the sacrifice was destined to inspire victory. The reality is far harsher. It only worked because others made the right choices afterward. If Greek cities had fractured again, if the fleet had failed to organize, if fear had outweighed resolve, Thermopylae would be remembered very differently. It might be a footnote, a cautionary tale, a brave but pointless stand. Meaning was not inherent in the sacrifice. Meaning was created later by decisions, coordination, and persistence. And that is why the myth matters so much, because myths allow us to skip the hard parts. They let us believe that courage alone is enough, that standing firm is always virtuous, that death, if dramatic enough, will justify itself. But Thermopylae teaches the opposite. It teaches that sacrifice without follow-through is waste, that courage without strategy is insufficient, that dying well does not guarantee anything. The men who stayed behind did their part, but their part only mattered because others did theirs. That truth makes the story less romantic but more honest, and honesty is dangerous. Because once you understand Thermopylae this way, you can't use it casually anymore. You can't point to it as proof that any hopeless stand is noble. You can't use it to silence questions or glorify loss without asking what comes next. You have to ask, what is this sacrifice for? Who benefits from it? And what responsibility do those who survive carry afterward? Those are not questions legends want you to ask. Legends want clarity. History gives you ambiguity. So over time, we chose clarity. We chose a story where the outcome was certain, the heroes were perfect, and the lesson was simple. We chose to remember the number instead of the process, the death instead of the delay, the stand instead of the withdrawals that made survival possible. We chose the version that made us feel inspired instead of uneasy. And that choice tells us more about ourselves than it does about the past, because Thermopylae isn't remembered incorrectly by accident. It's remembered incorrectly because the real version challenges how we think about heroism. It suggests that real courage often looks like discipline, patience, and restraint, that sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is accept loss without pretending it's glorious. It reminds us that history is built by people who rarely know how their story will end. And maybe that's why we keep returning to Thermopylae, not because it reassures us, but because deep down we sense there's more to it than the legend allows. The narrow pass is long gone, the coastline has shifted, the battlefield doesn't look the way it once did, but the questions Thermopylae raises are still with us. How much is too much to lose? When is sacrifice necessary? And when is it just symbolic? Who gets remembered and who fades away? The real Battle of Thermopylae doesn't answer those questions neatly. It leaves them with us, and maybe that's the point. If we stop treating Thermopylae as a story about dying and start treating it as a story about decision-making under pressure, it becomes far more relevant and far more challenging. It stops being about ancient warriors and starts being about us, about how we remember the past, about what kinds of stories we choose to tell, about whether we value truth or comfort more. Because in the end, Thermopylae was not the moment Greece proved it would never fall. It was the moment Greece proved it was willing to make hard choices and live with them. And that is a legacy far more difficult than legend. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what really happened at Thermopylae, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories where history gets stripped of its myths and told as it actually was. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this story surprised you the most, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.